So what we'll do is take about 10 minutes to set up, and then we'll phase into a bit of a panel discussion, and interlocutors welcome in the course of things. Circulating is a schedule so that people can look ahead if there are other segments that you'd like to sit in on today. And of course, I could not resist a handout. People who know me know my propensity, and so I've offered some quotations in which to ground yourself as we go along today. So we welcome you to this day of collective work on the concept of poetic attention, about which and from which our initiative has been thinking this year, in part as anchored in the work of Lucy Alford, and then ramifying from there. So this has been the work of this past season. And in the course of today, we're inviting everyone to think together, to think in capacious ways, in order to explore the potential of the concept, to this concept that is somewhat enigmatic, somewhat mysterious, and we hope generative. We want to explore together what it might mean and do, what it might achieve as a concept in our times, in our days of the attention economy. So for today's work, we've brought together people from different perspectives, fields, areas of work, such as attention studies, literary studies, creative practice in poetry, cognitive neuroscience, and geography, to think in ensemble about how this concept registers with you, and how you would be inclined to define it in your own thinking, and what work it might do in your own practice. And so this is what we'll phase toward today in the course of the segments. And I want to gesture ahead to what's coming up later today. In fact, in about an hour's time, we will welcome Sarah Protz, who is here from the University of Alberta. I'll say a bit more about the keynote talk from Sarah. And we want to welcome the poets from whom we will hear this afternoon: Louise Dupré, Joel Anthony Harris, Lee Catherine Hodge, Chad Norman, and Derek Webster. And we want to welcome Montreal artist Kevin Jenny, whose paintings will actually be available in the room across the hall. When we adjourn for lunch, Kevin will have some of his new paintings displayed on exhibit, and he'll have a few moments to talk about new practice that he's doing actually from the idea of attention. I also want to gesture toward Dr. Yvonne Hung, who will be with us a little bit later, whose work in geography and environmental science informs her work in writing pedagogy. And she will actually make available a nature walk. So if people are inclined, inspired, just after we get a bite of lunch in the other room, at 1:30, Yvonne will take us outside, and there's actually a practice in attention that she'll take us through. And this is why we warned people to bring footwear that was suitable, because there might be mud before showers. So let me open with a few further introductory remarks on poetic attention. I want to, first of all, pay attention to the people who made today's work possible, including the McGill Writing Center, the Department of English at McGill, and the Linda Fernandez Fund and the Department of English, the McGill Arts Internship Office, and the Center for Literatures in Canada at the University of Alberta. And I want to thank also to the people who were putting the work of this session together, including but not limited to James Jarrett and Charlotte Frank, who were creators of the publicity and beautiful posters for this event, Gael Perron and Ronnie Litvak-Katzman, and Megan Switzer for support on overseeing logistics. And I want to pay attention also to some language from poet Audre Lorde that captures the convictions from which our initiative works, that poetry is not a luxury. Poetry, Audre Lorde says, is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams toward survival and change. First made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. We would also like to begin by acknowledging that we're located on unceded indigenous lands on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, one of the founding nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The Kanien'kehá:ka are recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the community of Tiohtià:ke. Poetry Matters stands against discrimination and oppression in all its modes, notably anti-Black racism. We stand in solidarity with communities of color, both in Montreal and around the world, as we all work to support each other in the fight to end racism in all its forms. And we stand in solidarity with the members of AGSEM, the Union of Teaching Assistants at McGill, who have been on strike this season. And I'd like to conclude the opening segment with a quotation from poet Claudia Rankine, which we've often used at Poetry Matters to open our events, from her poem, Weather. We're out to repair the future. There's an umbrella by the door, not for yesterday, but for the weather that's here. I say weather, but I mean a form of governing that deals out death and names it living. I say weather, but I mean a November that won't be held off. This time, nothing, no one forgotten. We are here for the storm that's storming. What's taken matters.
Quite literally.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, weather. Yeah, speaking of weather. Seeking to be attuned and attentive to the weather. So let me begin then by pointing to some of the ideas that we've been working from, advanced by the research of Lucy Alford, who works in poetry studies. And this will take you to the handout with a few quotations that I hope you can ground in and take with you. Alford, in her recent book, Forms of Poetic Attention, seeks to consider the forms or varieties of attention that are activated, elicited when we read poetry. And there's some definitional work that opens the handout. Alford is also interested in adjacent forms of attention that come into play when people create poetry. But the primary focus of her discussion is on how poetic language, as formed and crafted language, works on our attention when we read poetry. As she says, and this is on the handout, the notion of poetic form is as old and familiar as the study of poetry itself, an easy shorthand for how poems work. But what exactly is formed in a poem? Do we mean its shape on the page, its sound in the ear, its sequence of images? It is true that poetic language is densely formed, but what is formed by and in poetic language is an event of attention generated in the acts of both reading and writing. I suggest that a poem might be better understood not simply as a gathering of composed formal features, but as an instrument for tuning and composing the attention. So Alford maintains the centrality of attention to poetic experience, and this is how she's deriving the idea of poetic attention. And she emphasizes that her book addresses the dynamics of poetic attention. Her work stands at the intersection of cognitive and literary studies, and she works in the area called attention studies, a field from which we have representatives here today. I'll speak to this because this is what we'll segue into with my colleague Jelena Ristic. One of the forms that the work of Poetry Matters with Poetic Attention has taken is a collaboration with colleagues at McGill's Laboratory for Attention and Social Cognition. And this year we're actually embarking on a new project of testing how modes of attention elicited by the experience of reading poetry might be read through the lens of attention studies, as associated with certain forms of brain activity, certain forms of cognition, and certain physiological responses. And so my colleague Jelena Ristic will be able to speak to that more attentively than I can in a few moments. But how does Lucy Alford define poetic attention? Initially, she defines it, stated simply, as the attention produced, required, or activated by a poem. And she says then, even if this sounds simple as an object of study, we need to recognize that there are many ways that poems engage our attention, and many minds contained in this hour of our attention, and both change contextually and historically. So what's at issue in this work are modes of attention. Her work encourages us to practice essentially attending to attention. And then she goes on to say that if we're thinking about poetic attention, and we're thinking adjectively about the poetic, in poetic attention, the poetic can move beyond the collection of loosely related entities convention has called poems. In this further sense of poetic attention, she says, I intend the first term, poetic, to modify the latter, attention, suggesting modes of attention that function poetically. So what does she mean by functioning poetically? She's suggesting that that refers to attentional acts and modalities that are fundamentally non-instrumental. Not subjugated to the conveyance or extraction of information, and not in the service of rhetorical persuasion. So it's that poetic function of poetic attention that we've been thinking about. How the modes of poetic attention that we can enter, often contemplative, and at a remove from the forms of attention we pay when we're seeking to navigate daily demands of the attention economy, how these might function in resistant ways with respect to the constant forces in our cultures pressing us toward productivity, pressing us toward proficiency and success understood in contemporary terms. So we've been thinking about the kind of resistant work that this concept of poetic attention might achieve. And so I just wanted to speak to something that I've been learning from colleagues in attention studies. As I understand what Jelena and others have been saying about attention, one metaphor for understanding the workings of attention is the moving spotlight, if I understand. So I lead from the idea that if we can become more aware of and in control of the modes of attention that we activate and move more intentionally to place the spotlight on some sites and entities and practices that our current conditions usually don't encourage us to emphasize, then we are engaging in the kind of work of resistance that I'm gesturing toward. And then I want to connect this to work in poetry from teaching over the years, because as those of you who know me know, I will always bring up the topic of close reading. Because I want to connect what Lucy Alford evokes with the concept of poetic attention to the kind of attention that people are asked to pay when we're engaging in techniques of close reading poetry, that time-honored practice. Immersed in forms of what I would understand as deep attention. And this is actually a theorized concept from Catherine Hales, from media theorist Catherine Hales. So I've been connecting poetic attention to deep attention and to close reading. I'll mention that close reading was just the subject of a superb talk by John Guillory in Montreal a few weeks ago, which some of you may have seen. John Guillory is most recently the author of Professing Criticism, and he focuses in his thinking on close reading as a technique that has been honed in the discipline and the workshops of literary studies over the decades, but that has also radiated out to the wider culture as a technique of interest. And he is at this point focused on the way that close reading, as we think about close reading, only poetry, of course I'm going to say poetry, but close reading texts more widely, how that can pay slow time, slow attention, and even artisanal attention to what is engaged. And so this is what he accented in the lecture that he gave the other week at Concordia University, which was focused on close reading. And then I want to lead you to one other bridge that we might work from today in conversation. When I think about the potentialities and the affordances of this idea of poetic attention, I've also been bringing Lucy Alford's ideas together with those of writer and artist Jenny Odell, whose quotations are on the back, which you might think from in the course of today. Jenny Odell, writer and artist, in her book, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, offers ways of thinking about how to withdraw strategically from the constant pressures constructing us as productive neoliberal subjects getting ahead, often by cultivating modes of attention and directionalities of attention that allow us to remove ourselves from the circuit of daily commitments and refuse their pressures. So this is how she gives an edge to the conception of attention, and I wanted to make that connection to Lucy Alford's work. Among the strategies that Odell asks us to think about for withdrawing and refusing is a strategy akin to what avant-garde composer Pauline Oliveros called deep listening. So Odell brings in deep listening as part of the strategy for this kind of work of attention. And so given all this, we've increasingly been feeling that there's an important kind of ethical work to be achieved by such a turn from ordinary modes of attention activated by our usual digital dailiness. And so that's one of the emphases for today. Different people from different perspectives thinking about the kind of ethical balancing that might come along with this conception of poetic attention. All right, so let me phase into other speakers. I'll turn things to my colleague, Jelena Ristic. And I'll mention that Jelena Ristic is a professor of psychology and cognitive neuroscience at McGill. Professor Ristic is a researcher whose research focuses on basic mechanisms of human attention, the cognitive neuroscience of attention, social and interactive cognition, social behavior and eye tracking, and attentional development. So those are some of her areas. I will say that when we were first in touch about this topic, one thing that she caught me on was that I was sort of assuming that we were conceptualizing attention in the same way. And she cut me short and she said, I think your group is thinking about attention in a way that is very different from the way that we think about and work with attention. So that's how I'll pass things along. And I'll invite you to think about this idea of poetic attention as it looks through your lenses. But maybe you could speak just a bit more to the work of the Attention Lab and how that has evolved. So, thank you.
So thank you, Miranda. Miranda and I met maybe a year ago or so, and she's quickly becoming my favorite collaborator because she's so open and inviting and tremendously capable in engaging her attention to look at things in a different way, and maybe the ways in which maybe she's not used to, she can often take a perspective of how we think about attention and we formulate it in a way that we didn't think about it. And so I thank you for organizing this. I thank you for putting the work together. And she often really shames me in the productivity she has.
We're supposed to be stepping away from that.
Yeah, well, right. So, and I got this introduction, so like the baton got passed to me to talk about the differences maybe in how attention is being understood, maybe experimentally versus intuitively. And so I'm going to carefully choose my words today, not because, because oftentimes when we think about attention experimentally, we inadvertently maybe, but maybe also consciously reject these intuitive thoughts about attention because cognition and cognitive neuroscience is an objective science. It's not a subject, like this is how we're set up to look at objective markers of mental processes or mental events or mechanisms in the brain. So I am what they call a classically trained attention researcher, and attention field is in fact fairly young. And it started with what we call a cognitive revolution. So we had a guy named B.F. Skinner who was kind of dominating the field of psychology up until maybe last part of the 60s, and there was no mind in his understanding of humans. It was all about stimulus and a response, right? There's a stimulus for me, there's water, and I drink the water. There's no interpretation of what the water feels like, or do I want water? And then what happened was a cognitive revolution where, a bunch of people said, well, wait, it's actually like, it's what happens in the mind that matters, not just the stimulus and response. The human there's a mind, there's an interpretation, there's a mental process that is within this behavior. And so the study of attention, really, experimental study of attention started in the early 70s, from zero ground. And the ground that we started from is William James, really, from 1890.
We have a quotation on the back.
Right. And, when I teach attention, and when I teach attention in sort of, introductory undergraduate, but also sort of higher level graduate courses, we always start with the definition. And so maybe I'll just kick this back to you, and maybe some of you can tell me, what is attention? Just like what you think it is, not maybe what you have read somewhere, but just intuitively, yes.
I think it would be being in the moment present and having a little hamster wheel, not talking. So you can absorb all the information.
Oh, so you have like a central controller, okay. Anyone else? Any other ideas? You can say anything. It turns out there's no correct answer here, so
yeah.
You can.
William James says everyone knows. Yeah. Okay. So.
Yeah. I'm getting there. There's actually a path. Yes. Go ahead, Sarah.
Connection. I was thinking of it.
Connection. Okay, that's very interesting. Okay. Yeah. Hi.
And something with an emotional charge, maybe?
Oh, interesting.
That's
So,
right.
okay, very interesting. And yeah.
I guess it might also include the idea that attention is directed at something either specific or nothing specific at all.
Okay.
In
So.
the present moment.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah, so that sort of syncs with what I wanted to say, which is the idea of putting bound.
Prioritize.
Of
time.
information.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It seems to me that attention is exclusive. You attend to something and not something else.
Interesting.
Potentially kind of choosing. Reason is for choosing.
Yeah, so these are all wonderful perspectives, and if you can notice, they're very diverse, right? And we all sort of intuitively feel to know what it is. We can all, I think, identify with what's being said, kind of a form of control, a form of engaging and disengaging, having kind of like a central executor, the hamster running, perimeters of information processing.
And emotional charge.
And emotional charge is very interesting because we, in fact, don't study that just yet, which is very interesting. And so, in his book, James defined attention as attention is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneous possible objects or trains of thought. But before this goes, everyone knows what attention is. It is taking possession of the mind. And this is the definition that we started with, and this is in fact the definition that we still have. And this is the major problem in our field because this is not an operationalized definition. For some of you who have experimental training, when we want to study something experimentally, we need to know what is it that we're studying. We need to put that in practice, operationalize. But what it does, this definition, I think, captures the multifaceted nature of the phenomenon, which again has maybe plagued the field because the field could take it in so many different directions and not agree on different facets. And so what we decided to do as a field is to study the functions of attention rather than attention as a whole. So we study, for example, focused attention versus non-focused attention. We study what happens to environmental information that is attended versus information that is not attended. How's that attention to, say, this water bottle? What does it do to the representation of the water bottle, to the memory of the water bottle, to the neural response to the water bottle? Now, we also study whether I willfully attend to the water bottle or if it drops to the floor, if it kind of grabs my attention. But the field really doesn't take into the account the overarching or like this whole, the whole that the mechanism may be. And so throughout our, 50 years of studying attention, what we sort of, I think, have agreed on, or what the studies are converging on, is that attention is a limited mental resource. So it's a finite mental resource. There's beginning and an end to it. I often think about it as a pot or a glass. It just has this capacity that the capacity doesn't exceed. We cannot make, like, this is the capacity. We cannot expand it. We oftentimes actually don't shrink it. This is the capacity. It just depends on what you fill it with, right? So maybe you fill the glass with one process, that is all-consuming, all capacity. Or if the processes are maybe less what we call attentionally demanding, then we can do 2 or 3, fit it into the glass, and this is what we call parallel processing. So we can manipulate those at the same time, right? So less attentionally demanding. So where was I going with this? So now I'm lost. So what I wanted to say is that attention is an intuitive ability, but we as a field do not quite have a firm grasp on what is it as a mental state. And in fact, when we go back to the James's principles of psychology, and this is where I connected, I think it resonated when Miranda contacted me about poetic attention, is that some of the ideas that Lucy Alford is talking about are actually quite, you can see them in James's writing. So the idea of a modal mental resource, a modal that you can engage it similarly with spoken and word, or with listening, or with viewing, right? Like it's an a-modal, what we call it, doesn't depend on modality. And we have lots of evidence for that it's an a-modal mental resource. There's also, but I think where we kind of jump from this experimental work into more exploratory, I think, field is when we start talking about attention as a transformational ability or transformational entity, I guess, in the brain, because I think that Alford talks about it, but also James does too, as attention about sort of like this, he calls it intellectual attention, which I think very closely aligns with poetic attention. So attention that is free from these influences as a mental restructuring resource that is able to kind of gather the thoughts and sort of like unify them and reformulate mental representations or understanding, right? And so James also talked about that. And so this is sort of how we got into this interdisciplinary work that we're doing, and some of these planned experiments that we will have, grounded in this type of thinking, but also in experimental paradigms or experimental tests that we know attention should produce in the brain, in the heart, in the eye tracking. And so we'll actually now be able to test, or at least see, how is poetic attention represented in the brain? Is it represented in the brain in a different manner? Is it an intuitive state, or is it a kind of body, the brain state as well? Are they reflected? And it really doesn't, like, even if it's not, I was telling Grandma's like, what if we don't find it in the brain? Like, it doesn't really matter, right?
We're searching, it's the quest.
Right.
Actually, so is it fair to say that what we're seeking are markers for different attentional states, as elicited by reading poetry? Does one use that vocabulary of markers?
Not really. So this is all uncharted territory that
Yeah.
we're kind of stepping
So
into.
I'm looking for lexicon.
Yeah, so I think what we'll look for, or at least some kind of known, we know a little bit of what attentional states do to the brain. And so we're going to look for those kinds of markers. We need to look for something. We can't just like, put people in the EEG and like.
They will be reading poetry, by the way, so this
Yeah,
is somewhat enjoyable.
So we will have this integrated EEG, eye tracking, and biosensors equipment that we can fit on people, and they'll be reading poetry that is understood to engage deep poetic or poetic attention. And then, with those poems, we are going to be able to look at specific brain states, what they look like. So the brain, the heart. So is the brain oscillation synchronized with heart rate oscillation, for example? Do eyes look differently when engaged in deep attention or poetic attention versus when just reading, like newspaper article? So it's going to be exploration, but I think it can tell us whether this intuitive state, this intuition that we have, has neural basis, at least in this kind of first.
And I just want to observe that Lucy Alford does differentiate between forms of attention that are activated by reading a newspaper and those that are elicited by reading poetry. So we'll be testing that.
So we have lots of work to do.
Yeah.
It's very uncharted territory. But for me, as an attention researcher, and I'll get to your question, it was interesting because I was always frustrated by the way we study attention in terms of tasks and stimuli, and just very devoid of real life performance. And when we started looking at in real life emotions, emotions are not they're not even considered. We consider them a confound.
Confound?
Yeah. So confound means like if it's like
the research?
Yes, it confounds the question. Emotions will confound the question of attentional response, right?
Poetry seeks to confound.
Yeah, definitely, yes. But in many ways, we'll kind of seek to confound and deconfound maybe in our research, or at least control the confounds so that we can see what kind of effect they have on mind and brain. But I wanted to say, just in closing, that the way that why I was interested in this is the way myself and my group study attention is with this kind of confounded mindset, which is why we're having oftentimes tough time publishing. Because we go against,
these are departures from the classical approaches.
These are very much departures
that's
from
what
classical approaches, yes.
Yeah.
So, we study how social interactions shape attention. We study how attention helps us socially interact with people, interpret what people are communicating to us, emotions. So those are kinds of things that we study, but of course, not on a much what we call lower level than something like more theoretical level than you guys are approaching it. So for me, this is very interesting kind of cross between the two perspectives. So I'm going to take this one first, and then
I want to say Charlotte Frank also has some remarks on how poetic attention is factored into your thinking. Yeah.
I'm done. Yeah. So I welcome your comments. Yes.
I have a question about experiment design. Will the reading be done out loud, or are they reading silently? And is it by people who are used to reading poetry? Are they reading poetry they're familiar with, or will it be new poetry?
So this is excellent questions we can answer. We're still sort of like So I'm going to tell you that I did not expect we were going to get funded Not because I did not believe in our project, but because, funding is hard to get. And, and so we are actually now embarking on this question. And yes, so we're thinking about those. And in fact, yes, we are going to have, so Miranda's going to choose the poetry,
Well, yeah.
and I'm going to choose the EEG parameters.
We're talking about it. And one model that I'll just refer to that I brought up is one from long ago. Because the other day at John Guillory's lecture at Concordia on close reading, he referred to the history of close reading in the 20th century and referred to the work of Ida Richards, who is a pioneering critic in English studies, as it was called. He did reading experiments with poetry in the 20s at Cambridge, and these have become rather fabled. There's often been the feeling that I. Richards was sort of ahead of his time, and I find that people now, like John Guillory, like Merve Emery, are going back to Richards and interested in these experiments in reading poetry and eliciting results. So to some extent, we're taking a cue from and bringing into the contemporary world and needs experiments of this kind. So that's one conception that's
One
involved.
aspect, yeah.
So.
Hi, yes, hi.
Well, the poetic genre has a variety of forms. So I was wondering if you have, or if you questioned whether specific forms have specific effects, or is there preference of forms, and how does the poetic form would affect this kind
That's
of
what we're.
So that's what we're going to be
Thinking
thinking about, and in fact, so I'm going to tell you this funding was based on a 3-minute pitch to judges over Zoom. And so when we pitched this to judges in 3 minutes, this is kind of the question that they asked. And they said, well, how are you going to, it's going to be enormous differences between people, I'm also, English is my second language, and so it's for me, it's also challenging to engage in poetry in English, in a way that it's required, especially the deep attention state. So what I think what we'll be looking at, and of course Miranda here is the expert, so she'll be choosing the material.
Alford's work speaks to this, by the way, to questions of poetic form. So she problematizes our commonsensical understandings of form, and so we'll be leading from some of the points that she raises about that.
But what we will be looking at, and this is a bit departure from a current sort of, I think, sort of movement in cognitive neurosciences to understand an individual, we will be looking for commonalities. So we will be looking for commonalities across participants and across texts that is assumed to engage deep attention. So we're looking at, is there something that is common, when people engage that we know, and we'll ask them, we'll have checks, and when they engage or when they achieve the state of poetic attention, is there a commonality in the brain, in the eye movement, in the heart rate?
We're looking for what feels like a kind of signature, and we don't know.
Sort of, yeah,
exactly.
exactly. We don't know if we'll find it. We don't know if it's there even, but we're going to try our best with this sort of first round.
Yeah.
And then we can do some very interesting things later on. For example, we can take one person's brain activity and then, while I read these, and then try to model what your brain activity will look like, right? And then try to model what your brain activity will look like. And those are some of the things that will lead us to maybe commonalities and differences. How people interpret it. It will tell us about the attentional system or whatever, this resource. It will tell us something basic about it. Tell us something about what is basic about this system and what is diverse about this system with the individual, with the material, with the experience, with language, and so on and so forth. So that's what we hope to do. Yeah.
And there are other models that are in play now, elsewhere, whereby people are engaging in research on neuroaesthetics. And so
Yes, so I think it's very
we're
similar.
drawing from this
Yes.
and then moving from Alford's work and moving forward. Because Charlotte Frank also has a few remarks.
Yes.
I want to segue there.
You want to just give a
Just a
lesson?
quick
Yeah.
question. Did you think about doing different studies about people, how they react when they hear a poem in their mother tongue or in English? Like you said, English is not your first language, right?
Not
So-
for this first
Okay.
round. So I think
Later.
we're going to try to establish our sort of groundwork this year. And then we might reconvene in a workshop and panel with data and theorists again. And then we can see where we can take it. Once we see what the data look like, then we can, there's all kinds of multiple ways that one can take this into, we can also look at behavior of participants when they read, when they're engaged in attention, how they move, how coordinated they are. That's something that I study, for example, in my work. So there's multitude of ways that we can take this